My encounter happened a few years ago in South Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Here in Louisiana, we call counties parishes, in case you didn't know. I was hunting deer or wild pigs one night on a protection levee system that was built to protect the town from hurricane floodwaters. As I walked to where the levee turns off to the left, there was a canal woods that was about 100 yards from some houses. To the left was a natural ridge that goes out into the swamps and marshes. Well, as I made that turn from the ridge of oak trees, I heard a growl. I thought it might have been a coyote or a dog, so I walked slower. And then, I heard brush and a smaller-sized tree shake and another growl. I shined my light in the direction of the sound and saw a pair of eyes that were reflecting an amber-yellow color. What surprised me was the fact that the brush was about 6 feet high and the eyes were about a foot above the brush. When I saw those eyes, I slowly backed up, while keeping my light on the thing. As I walked back to the turn to head back to my truck, which was parked about 3/4 of a mile away, it came out of the woods. I lit the thing up with my light again. Now, I was probably 30 feet from it, and I saw its whole body and face. The body was covered with black hair, with some brown mixed in. The hair was thickest around its head, neck, chest, and upper back. It looked a lot like a lion's mane, but wasn't as pronounced, since all the hair was the same color. It had pointy ears, with a little bit of hair coming off the points, making the ears seem a little longer. It stood on 2 legs, but the legs were weird and backward-like. The arms were really long, longer than the legs even, and its hands were like a mixture of human and bear, like really big raccoon front paws. It had paws, but it also had fingers. That's the only way I know how to describe it. If you watch the movie The Howling, you'll get an idea of what this thing looked like. It's as if whoever made that movie knew something others didn't. Now, at this point, I was freaking out, so I pulled up my rifle. I hunt with a Romanian AK with a camo paint job I did myself. The way I was hunting wasn't exactly legal. That's why I took my Romanian AK. If I had to toss it, it wouldn't be out much money. The rounds I use are special rounds made to hunt feral hogs. I've dropped deer and hogs with these rounds before, one shot and they are done. But back to the story. As I pulled my rifle up to the ready, it growled and walked a few steps toward me. I fired a round right into its chest area. I knew I had hit it good because the creature took a step back. As it stepped back, I ran toward my truck. That's when it let out a loud growl and a howl like I had never heard before. I grew up hunting and fishing and thought I knew everything in the woods, but I hadn't heard anything like the sounds it made before. And as I ran back to the truck, it stalked me but kept its distance. As I got close to the well-lit area where my truck was parked by the town library and elementary school, it eventually stopped following me. I tried to find anyone who may have had similar encounters in the area, but all I could find was old legends of the Rougaroo, which is pronounced Rougaroo. I told my grandpa about what had happened, but told him it was a friend who had also told me what happened to him. I also told him that it sounded like a crazy story to me, and he told me that when he was 17, in the same area at night hunting, he heard a howl like nothing he had ever heard before. He also told me that something had stalked him as he ran home that night. He said he never saw what it was, but could hear it following him through the brush and swamps. That encounter has forever changed my life. My perception of what is real and what is not will never be the same again. I still haven't gotten over that night. I went back a few days after that incident and found 2 large dog tracks as big as my hand, and I wear a size large glove. I was 14 years old and lived in central Louisiana at the time. My mother had always been interested in the paranormal. She'd buy copies of UFO magazine and watch documentaries on Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, etc. So I just grew up being interested in things like that at face value. I always believed in them, but I never had any inkling that werewolves, dogmen, or whatever could possibly exist in any way. Anyway, I lived in a mobile home at the time, well, a mobile home park to be exact, which was on a 2-lane highway. Highway 28 East, to be exact. It was a long street with a cul-de-sac type of dead end, and at the dead end to the left was the only brick home in the park. Straight ahead was thin woods and several trails going off in every direction. To the right, slightly, was a deep ditch that people had dumped junk and trash in, like old washing machines, broken laundry baskets, or what have you. A thin metal wire fence ran from the ditch across into the woods and out of sight. We, all the kids in the neighborhood, had what we called a club, where we would all gather to hang out. Some of us had gathered busted or discarded dining room chairs and placed them in the center of what was the thinnest area of trees. I had come there to figure out where to put everything. Beyond the deep ditch, further into the woods, was a small stream with hills on each side. An enormous old oak tree had fallen beside the stream on the side I was on. I spotted an old metal folding table near the stream and went down to inspect it. I thought it would be a good item to put in the center of the chairs. It seemed to be in good condition, so I decided to head home. I figured I'd get it the next morning. The next morning, I made my way toward the metal wire fence, which somehow had been bent on both its top and bottom. I was about to duck under it when I heard the distinct sound of sniffing, so I turned to see what it was. Standing on the other side of the stream was a 7 to 8 foot tall creature sniffing the air. Its head was turned slightly. The first thought that entered my mind was, "Oh my God, werewolves are real." It stood on two powerfully built, muscular legs which ended in enormous paws. It had no tail that I saw. It had a massive chest and as well as extremely muscular arms and hands. The hands seemed to have the same kind of pads that a paw has, but they were arranged differently. It had a wolf-like head and tall, pointed ears. The eyes glowed red, and the ears were in proportion to the head. It had a snout or muzzle. It kept sniffling the air as it stepped over the tree trunk like it was nothing. I would have had to physically climb it to get over it, and I thought it was coming after me. It stopped and seemed to be breathing or panting, but there was this deep rumble that accompanied it. I decided to get out of there before it did see me and ducked up under the fence. I ran to my bike, which was parked off the road, and paddled my butt home. I never went to those woods again, and after that, about a month and a half or so later, we moved to Mississippi. It wasn't until many years later that I discovered the term Dogman. It scared me, but also started me on my fascination with ancient myths, legends, werewolves, and many other non-Bigfoot cryptids. I'm a night owl. I always stay up late and at night and watch TV. I just happened to look out my window one night and saw what I initially thought was a man sitting on a roof. I thought it was a man because at first he looked almost naked until I saw the hair or fur on him. He then turned his face, and what I saw then was frightening. He had pointed ears like a dog and a long snout. They were almost like a German shepherd's ears. I could not understand what I was looking at. I just stared at him for a few minutes, and I felt like if I moved, it would see me. It sat there on its butt with human-looking arms and legs, but with hair or fur covering them. I backed away from the window very slowly and went to tell my husband. He didn't want to get up and go look, though, and thought I was crazy. When I went back to the window, it was gone. Now, I don't know or understand what I saw that night, but I did tell my husband and kids what I saw. It has haunted me for many years until I was just telling a few of my grandchildren recently at camp. One of them got on the computer and found some pictures of what they thought I meant. It was so scary. I was looking at the same thing I saw on the roof that night. I cannot believe it. As I sit here looking at that picture, I did not know it really existed many, many years ago. One morning, around 6 a.m., about 2 years ago, I was living not far from Washington, D.C. A friend of a friend needed a roommate to afford the rent for an apartment he had around. So, when I was told about this, my first thought was, oh yeah, here's my chance to move out of my parents' house. After about 6 months of living in the area, I noticed that on certain nights I would hear loud roars in the distance. I could never tell how far away the noise was coming from. It would sometimes sound nearby, or just far enough away where I wouldn't mind being outside to see what it might be making the sound, from a safe distance, of course. I lived in a quiet, wooded area. A lot of people lived in the area. I actually lived within 5 minutes walking distance away from the University of Maryland. One morning, around 6 a.m., I just snapped awake from a deep, sound sleep. And for no reason at all, I started to go back to sleep, but thought to myself, why am I wide awake and alert? It was strange. I was completely awake. And then, right in my backyard, I heard a low, deep growl. That's when I knew something was up. The moment I heard that, I knew. That was why I woke up. I remained quiet and didn't move for the next 5 to 10 minutes as this thing started to become very active in my backyard. It went from the low growls to heavy breathing. This thing's lungs had to be massive because it sounded the same exact way a horse would if you were standing right next to it. When it breathed through its nose, it sounded more like a horse, but this thing sounded like it was aggressive. I knew it wasn't a horse in the backyard. That wouldn't even be possible, but what I saw was very real. It literally ran from my backyard into the dividing fence of my backyard, and from my neighbor's backyard again and again. It made no sense for it to be doing that. It would often stop and sniff around and sneeze very loudly. It sounded like it was right next to my window, and I was on the second floor. I didn't want to look out the window because I thought that there was no way in the world no one else is hearing this right now but me. I thought, this thing is trying to get my attention on purpose. I just stayed still in bed without moving, and I was beyond scared. I really thought it was a werewolf, even before I saw it. I always thought that they were real. The guys that lived below me started yelling and screaming, El Diablo! El Diablo! Over and over again. They yelled that. I could hear the thing leaving the backyard, so I heard to try and get a look at it. And when I did, all I saw was its backside. This thing was massive with broad shoulders, like a bodybuilder, and it had ears sticking up on its head. It slowly walked away until I lost sight of it. I'm reporting on a possible Dogman sighting based on the info provided by my son and his friend. This occurred in Montgomery, Massachusetts. As a four-wheel enthusiast, my oldest son has become familiar with off-roading trails and rural routes that he and his friends use regularly, often at nighttime. On this occasion, they were in his Ford Explorer following a family route in a rural town through a remote wooded area. Being winter, the plows stopped at a certain point, leaving a bank of snow at that point, marking where the town abandoned maintenance of that unpaved road for the winter, leaving further use of this road to those who dare. As my son related, he four-wheeled through the snowbank and drove along the road, which winded over a mountain. He concentrated on his driving, focusing on the road, and as his close friend sat in the front passenger seat, suddenly his friend exclaimed, Look, what's that? What is that?" My son didn't lift up his eyes to see it because he wanted to stay on the road. His buddy pointed to where it went. So my son quickly swung his truck around and illuminated the area with his off-road lights and headlights. His friend described what he saw as a running like a wolf, but not a wolf. He said it was big like a bear, but not a bear. He also said it had long hair and was lighter in color than a brown bear. He said it was gray in color. They sat there for a minute or so, staring into the darkness, and suddenly something pushed the SUV from behind, making it slide along the muddy, snowy road, a short distance. They both whipped their heads around, only to see the blackness of night, and out of the rear window. Then he quickly started the truck and sped out of there, not seeing the creature again. My son stated that it could have been the same creature his buddy spotted, because once he had illuminated the area with the truck's lights, they would have spotted movement against the white snow background. Another of my son's friends insisted that this is a Bigfoot, as he had had an encounter years ago, but this description seems to be a better fit for a Dogman. This experience, whatever it was, is absolutely true. Back in 2004, my husband and I were given 3 of our grandchildren to raise. They were boys aged 1.5, 3, and 4.5 years old. The boys were followed a few months later by their sister, a newborn who was also given to us to raise. and after having raised our children, my husband and I found ourselves as new parents again. We lived in a small town in New England, so small that you could step out of the house and see the police station, fire department, and post office just beyond the house. When I was young, we had stop signs downtown where there are stoplights now. My grandmother and father were born there, and I lived for 6 decades in that town. It was the kind of place where if you needed some vegetables for supper, you went to a neighbor who had a garden, took what you needed, and left the money on their front porch. We lived on the main street, but were surrounded by many forested acres. 3 rivers run through the town, and we had a large field behind our house. There were many fields throughout the town, and other towns nearby were similar in makeup. There were also farms in the area and in the neighboring towns too. They were very New England-type towns, small, comfy, and cozy. When the children first came to live with us, both my husband and I worked. He worked at a transit company in a local city, and I worked as a paralegal. My job was a 4-hour commute, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. I would be gone from the house for 12 hours a day at minimum. I often worked weekends too. My husband took a leave of absence from his job and stayed at home with the children for 2.5 years. When he returned to work, he worked the night shift. That enabled him to watch the children during the day, but he did his best with the children while I was at work, and given the circumstances, he did a good job. One day after work, when the youngest children were 6 and 4 respectively, I came home to find the house in a state of disarray. Supper hadn't been made, and the kids were running to me with quite a story about a big gorilla that had been outside that day. The 2 youngest let me know that during the afternoon they saw a big gorilla in front of the house, running along the street. They said it was very fast, and then the big gorilla jumped our picket fence and ran into our yard. The children said that they had their noses pressed against the window pane and that the big gorilla came up to the window, growled at them, and then pushed its paws against the window. The children said that they tried to wake up my husband, but he had fallen asleep on the couch and they could not rouse him. The big gorilla then ran into the backyard where it broke some car windows and threw about some trash cans. I didn't disbelieve the children. I was just too exhausted to deal with it and respond with my "that's nice" comment that I used for anything I couldn't handle at the moment. I do recall reading in the newspaper a few days later that the police were warning folks about vehicle damage, but I never gave that any further thought. I didn't give it any further thought even though a few years prior to the gorilla incident, I had seen a very large dead wolf that I presumed had been hit by a car, laying on the roadside. It was not a coyote, nor was it a coy dog that we had in the area. I had seen pictures of wolves, and this one was immense. I had personally seen coy dogs while riding my horse along the trails. The wolf body was gone the next day, and no mention by authorities of any wolf sightings was in the newspapers. I thought that was sort of unusual. Did we have wolves in our area? Wouldn't that be newsworthy? Didn't anyone else see this wolf? Obviously, someone had as its body was gone the following day. I also did not give the big gorilla story too much thought, and even though the years before the children came, both my husband and I had witnessed a large dog-type footprints in our backyard. We mentioned those prints to a friend of ours, the animal control officer in a nearby town, who didn't seem too surprised by our find. However, we never discussed anything further. I don't give the big gorilla story much thought either, even though at about the time we saw the dog prints in our backyard, our cats had started to go missing. I found one of our cats, Peter, the best hunter in town, high up on my neighbor's roof. The house was 3 stories with the first floor and the second occupied by tenants, and the third being an attic. Lots of those older homes in New England always had full attics. I called Peter, managed to enter the building, and climbed to the second floor with a clothes basket. Story. When the children got a little older, we moved to North Carolina. It was in North Carolina when the children were more near their teens that I found a YouTube channel, and I listened to it intently. Recently, while driving down the street, I started connecting the dots. The idea of it jolted me and my brain awake. Wait a minute, I thought. Did they say big gorilla and something very fast when the children told me their story? Did the children have an encounter with something those years back? I immediately spoke with our 12-year-old and 14-year-old separately. Do you remember the time you told me the story about the big gorilla? The 12-year-old energetically told me every single thing she remembered. The animal was very large and very fast. It had black hair and it had a long, bushy tail. It growled. It had paws with fingers, and it stood up and pushed on the window with those paws. It ran very fast and had jumped over the fence. It had run into the backyard and made a lot of noise breaking things. The 12-year-old said it did not have the face of a gorilla or monkey, but she couldn't tell more about the face because of the hair. The 14-year-old shivered when I asked if he remembered it. He said he would never forget that thing coming into the yard. He remembers it clearly as if it were yesterday. He too remembers the swiftness of the creature, the black hair on it, and how it had jumped the fence and was running amok from the front to the backyard. He said he doesn't know what it was and still doesn't, but that he hopes to never see anything like that again. The children now know about Dogman, Bigfoot, and other cryptids. They didn't when they saw the big gorilla, though, and neither did I. We've all received an education from listening to several YouTube videos on these. We're aware that dogmen don't always stay in forest. They're often seen among neighborhoods. And perhaps, just perhaps, the creature my children saw all those years ago was just that, a dogman in a small New England town. I never saw it, but in 1975 I was newly married, about 21 years old, and had a small baby. My sister, who was a teenager, was visiting us at the time. My husband, my sister, and I had all gone to our bedrooms to settle down and go to sleep. I would say it was around 11 or 12 at night. We were just starting to relax and get sleepy when out of nowhere there was this horrible, loud howl. I mean, it was so loud it made my chest vibrate and my ears hurt. The sound was not human, but had a guttural, human-like sound, mixed with what sounded like a wolf. We were living in a mobile home at the time, and it howled just outside our back door, in the hallway near our bedroom. We jumped out of bed, looked at each other, and both said at the same time, "What the hell was that?" My husband was 10 years older than I was, and an avid hunter. He wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily, and his face even drained of color. My sister came running down the hallway, white as a ghost, and said, "What was that?" I told her I didn't know. My husband said that he was getting his rifle and grabbed it out of the closet. He opened up the back door and yelled out into the wind, "You better get the hell out of here or I will blow your head off." He listened a moment before I yelled at him to please shut the door. He did, and we never heard any more after that. Needless to say, we stayed up all night, afraid to go to sleep. I have never forgotten that howl, and there's no way it was a dog or coyotes. It wasn't a guy joking around either. It was so loud, there's no way a human could have made that sound. I love your show, and I'm glad to hear I am not the only one who has heard something like this. My encounter happened back in February of 2009. In November of 2008, I broke my arm and was basically stranded at home. I was unable to drive or work and was going stark, raving mad with boredom. My best friend would drive the 35 miles north from Muskegon to pick me up in Shelby, just to take me back to Muskegon for a visit at her home. She'd take me to dinner or out to see a movie, only to deliver me home to Shelby, after whichever activity. It was truly a selfless act of love. One night, though, she was driving me home. It was very late, well after 11 p.m., and we were on US 31 northbound, around the Rothbury area of Oceana County, on the expressway. Being February in Michigan, the roads were naturally snowy, with scattered patches of ice and bare pavement. There was a small pickup truck in front of us, about 5 car lengths ahead of her car, when all of a sudden, we saw something on 2 legs dart out from the left, just in front of an overpass. It ran across the 2-lane highway and hit the back of the small pickup in the rear quarter panel, causing the pickup to fishtail. Luckily, the driver of the small pickup regained control, but they didn't stop to see what collided with their truck. If anything, it seemed to pick up speed and get the heck out of there. My friend and I watched in utter astonishment as the creature finished running to the right and disappeared into the weeds and trees along the way. It didn't even break stride after it hit the truck. We looked at one another, sat in silence for a moment, and then I just said, Did you see? She said, "Yeah, I saw that." We finished the ride to my house in silence, both lost in our thoughts. It looked like a giant dog or wolf. It was on its hind legs. I mean, not all fours, it was on two legs, and it was at least 7 feet tall. It had pointed ears, kind of like a mane around its neck. More like a lion's mane to be exact, though, and was dark in color, and its hind legs looked like a dog's, which was even more pronounced, as it was running only on its hind legs. Its front legs were freely swinging as it ran, and it seemed to have its mouth slightly open. It had an elongated face, very much like a collie face, and a long nose protruding from its face. Its face was covered by longish hair. The entire creature seemed to be covered in long hair, but I can't recall if it had a tail or not. Something tells me it did, but I can't recall for certain, so I don't want to say it did, but when in fact I'm not sure. We thought perhaps it may not have been one of the Michigan Dogmen that are said to be in our area. Being a former Native American area, we have heard the stories but never met anyone that had a first-hand encounter. It was always someone who knew someone who knew someone who saw something. But now, my best friend and I definitely saw it. We had a first-hand experience, and our encounter was brief and over in a matter of mere moments. But it was front and center of us, and we saw it clear as a bell. I encountered a bipedal wolf-like creature here in western Michigan, and it's got me spooked. I was out shoveling snow, as it's common here in my state. My encounter happened in a place just south of Rothbury, Michigan. I decided to take a walk in my family's woods one day, and that's when my life changed forever. That's when my family's life changed forever. My family owns 270 acres of land here in the town or city of Montague, Michigan. I ventured out to those woods as I've done many times. The walk started as one normally would. I started to follow the creek south to check for deer stands on our property. The walk went as planned until I got about 300 or so yards from south of the house. I stopped to have a cigarette, and my eyes started to wander as I scoped for deer or coyote. As I gazed back and forth, I noticed this figure and I froze. I literally froze. This thing made eye contact with me and then stood up. It was hairy, had very broad shoulders and amber-colored eyes. It let out a growl unlike any other I've heard. This wolf, as I call it, made 2 leaps and was gone. The most surprising thing about this encounter was how silent the woods were up to this point when I had my encounter. I was arriving home to my apartment at around 11:45 p.m. when I felt a presence by the woodline. I saw something looking at me, and then finally, I saw these 2 eyes. It seemed like it was stalking me. I could only see eyes and the shape of its head. I really couldn't see its body, but instantly, I felt fear and went inside my apartment. When I went inside, I started looking through the blinds, just a little bit. I didn't want to move the blinds that much because I knew he knew where I was, so I didn't want to move the window blinds at all. Then I saw it heading my way. This beast looked like a bodybuilder with a wolf or dog-like head. Because of its silhouette, this thing must have been 7 to 8 feet tall. It just stopped for a second right in front of my window, and then it left. I've never feared for my life like I did that night. I have had 3 different encounters with 3 different creatures. I know what I saw. When I was younger, I saw what looked like a wolf or a big German shepherd on its hind legs running through a very thick patch of woods, but it only happened for a second. But I remember the long muzzle and pointed ears distinctively. The second encounter was more exciting. It was late at night after a small barbecue party at my uncle's farm, miles north of Ann Arbor. I was coming out of the barn to get some more food when I heard sticks breaking in the tree line to my right. My first impression was that one of the dogs got outside, so I went to go see if that was the case. I walked towards the sound and remember hearing the creature flinch because the movement stopped as I approached. I called out for the golden retriever and peered into the trees. The barn had spotlights facing the house, and with the white paint job on it, they created a glow that allowed me to see better. About 7 feet off the ground, a long muzzle poked through the trees, followed by the full figure of this creature. It was only 20 feet away from me, so I got the full picture, believe me. It was tall and lean but very muscular. It had a distinct brown pelt on its body with blackish fur on its shoulders. It had huge paws for feet, but its hands looked like they had 5 fingers, so they resembled long human hands, except for the fur and claws on them. Its head was the scariest, though. This thing had a huge set of canines, and it looked like it was snarling, but I believe it was trying to smile. I couldn't make out exactly what its eye color was because of how dark it was, but they pierced into my very soul. And as the creature came to full view, I remember saying out loud to myself, "Werewolf!" I backed up slowly, and the creature stood there, like a proud man standing over a deer he just had hunted down. It watched me for about 30 seconds, but it felt like 30 minutes. And that's when my father, uncle, cousin, and grandfather all came out of the barn. When I tell you this thing ran, I mean it ran. It turned around, dropped to all fours, and leapt into the forest, making only a slight noise. I told my cousin about it, but he didn't believe me. I knew my father wouldn't believe me because he doesn't believe in anything. 4 days ago, in my own backyard, the same type of creature knocked on my window. My curtains were drawn to give me a view of the woods. I live in the middle of a patch of woods, near a fire road. I wasn't asleep yet and couldn't describe what was wrong, but I just felt uneasy for some reason. I was trying to sleep when I heard a slight scrape at the house wall, below my window. My window is 8 feet off the ground, and when I sat up in bed to see what was going on, I saw the head of what I can only describe as a werewolf in my window, which is only 10 feet from my bed. I cursed, jumped up, turned on the light, and grabbed the survival machete I had in my closet. I turned to see if it was still there, and it had disappeared. The next day, I went out to see if I could find any tracks or anything that might prove what I saw, but I never found a thing. For about a day, I was unsure of myself, but then I decided that it was important for me to go ahead and get the word out.